So we'll now try to see how inflation affects asset returns. Generally speaking, inflation grows when the economy expands. It declines when the economy slows. So bonds generally perform well during low inflation as duration plays in. So as interest rates go down, bond prices go up. Unless of course credit concerns overtake. In that case, yields will go up and bond prices will go down. Low to moderate inflation is good for equities. So if $100 was my selling price, $50 was my cost, and $50 was the net profit of a company, if sales increase by 2%, costs also increase by 2%, it will not have a very detrimental impact because even profits will increase by 2%. So moderate inflation is good for equities. They would generally be able to pass on the price hikes to the customer. However, we have seen that inflation above 3% is problematic wherein it becomes difficult to pass on the increase in the costs and the increase in the cost of production. Real assets, commodities, real estate provide a good hedge against inflation. As prices of commodities rise, prices of all these things will also go up. A quick revision of the monetary policy. It is used as a counter-cyclical force to optimize the economy's performance. The objective is to control inflation while achieving a sustainable growth rate in the economy. Reducing short-term rates will result in more borrowing, that is more consumption, more business spending, more higher stock and bond prices. Increasing interest rates will have the opposite impact. The Taylor rule says that the government normally has a target rate of interest in mind. That target rate of interest depends on the trend growth rate of GDP and the trend inflation rate or the target inflation rate which the central bank wants to keep. So that is the minimum rate that anyways we have to offer our customers or offer the investors, otherwise they would not invest. So at least the inflation should be met and the trend GDP or the trend real return should be given by the bond. The question is that should the central bank keep interest rates higher than the neutral rate or should the rates be kept lower than the neutral rate? If we see that the economy is overheating, that is GDP growth rate is much higher than the trend rate, or if inflation is much higher than the target, then the central bank should increase interest rates in order to cool down the economy. If vice versa is happening, that is GDP growth is too low, inflation is too low, then the central bank should reduce interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. If interest rate is greater than the neutral rate, we say it's a recessionary or a contractionary monetary policy. If the target interest rate is lower than the neutral rate, then we say that the bank is following an expansionary monetary policy. The Taylor rule says that the target is equal to the neutral long-term rate plus 0.5 into the output gap, that is the GDP expected minus the GDP trend, plus 0.5 into the inflationary gap, that is inflation expected minus the inflation target. So if inflation is too high, rates would tend to go up. If inflation is low, rates would tend to go down. If GDP is too high, rates would tend to go up, restricting the economy. If GDP is too low, rates would go down, expanding the economy. Neutral rate is generally derived as the trend GDP growth rate plus the target inflation that the central bank wants to keep. So any investor should at least be given the inflation and the real GDP rate so as to make him invest. If the target is higher than this neutral, then we say recessionary and vice versa. Given the following information, calculate the short-term rate target. Neutral rate is 5%, inflation is 2.5, expected inflation is 6.5. GDP long-term trend is 3 and expected GDP is 4%. The target inflation is 2.5%. So inflation is much higher than target. GDP growth is much higher than trend. Both factors suggesting that interest rates should be increased. Or the actual interest rate should be 5% plus 0.5 into 4 minus 3 plus 0.5 into 6.5 minus 2.5, that is 7.5%. Fiscal policy, very quickly, is the changes in taxation and government spending to affect economic activity. Please remember, it is not the level of the budget deficit, rather the change in the level of the deficit that indicates the direction of the policy. So if deficit is going up, policy is expansionary. If budget deficit is going down, policy is contractionary. The yield curve tells us the spot rates at different maturities. So if you were borrowing for a period of 1 year, the rate of interest applicable would be so much. Rate is always annualized. If you are borrowing for a period of 2 years, the rate would be so much, so on and so forth. Generally, the yield curve is upward sloping, representing a liquidity premium for longer term investments. However, we have seen that yield curve can take on various shapes during various phases of the economy. So if both fiscal and monetary policy are expansive, that is, short-term rate is low because government is stimulating, and government spending is also quite high, that is, government is borrowing and spending, tax collections are low, then the curve will be steeply upward sloping because the central bank that affects the short-term rates has kept these rates low. However, government, which normally borrows in 10-year bonds and longer-term bonds, is doing a lot of borrowing because fiscal policy is also expansive. So as government borrows a lot, the long-term rates will tend to go up. So remember that monetary policy generally affects the shorter end of the curve because government borrowing or government regulations affect the short-term borrowing, 1 day, 15-day, 1 year money market instruments more than the longer-term borrowing. Fiscal policy will have a relatively higher impact on the longer-term rates because government borrowing less will indicate more money available, government borrowing more will indicate less money available and higher rates. If both are restrictive, that is, the short-term rates have also been kept high, and the government is also not borrowing much. So the short-term rates are high, but in the long run, people don't estimate much demand for money because at such higher rates, nobody is borrowing, government is also not spending, tax rates are also high. So even though short-term rates have been kept high by the central bank, long-term money is available at a cheaper rate. So people are willing to lock in their money for the longer term, even if they're getting a slightly lower rate. So if both are restrictive, yield curve would be downward sloping. If one is expansive and the other is restrictive, then we cannot say. But generally speaking, monetary policy will dominate the shorter term segment of the yield curve. So we see that economic growth consists of trend growth and some cyclical effects. The trend growth comes either from changes in employment, that is more labor force, or the same labor force working more productively. Changes in employment will happen if population grows, or if more women come into the workforce, or people retire later, people start working younger, so the rate of labor force participation increases. Changes in productivity will happen if we employ more capital. So if we give people more tools, they will be more productive in their jobs. Or if we increase the total factor productivity, that is, we increase their skill, we invent better technology, so on and so forth. So these two factors result in GDP growth that goes as an input to many of our models that we studied earlier. So if Thailand is an emerging economy and you are provided with the following economic and demographic statistics, the population is expected to grow by 3%, labor force participation is expected to grow by 0.75%, total factor productivity will grow by 0.9%, spending on new capital inputs is projected to grow at 4.25%. Compute the long-term projected growth rate. So in the long term, if all factors are fully utilized, then we will have 3% more people working, 0.75% of the time longer, or 0.75% more women and old people coming back into the workforce. The technology is getting better to the extent of 0.9%, and new capital inputs have increased to the extent of 4.25%, resulting in a long-term growth rate of 8.9%. So if we remember the CIGX model of aggregate demand or of calculating the GDP, see, that is, consumer spending is the largest component of most countries' GDP. However, the good part about this component is that it doesn't fluctuate much. So if our income doubles, it's not like we'll start eating twice the amount of food, or we'll start wearing twice the amount of clothes. So definitely our spending will increase, but not in the same proportion as our income growth. More of it will start getting saved. Investment, government spending, net exports are dependent on government policies, interest rates, outlook on profitability, as we've studied earlier in the first two levels. It is generally advised that government should provide the basic infrastructure, judicial system, education system, roads, but not interfere with the economy or interfere as little as possible in the production of most other things. So they should be left for the private sector to do, as investments in that manner will be a lot more efficient. Fiscal policy should not be overly stimulating. So you should not keep borrowing and keep spending on various schemes and various social causes without any regards to productivity and fiscal deficit. So it is okay to stimulate sometimes in recessionary times or when things are particularly bad, but be aware that stimulating too much will require printing of the currency, which can cause devaluation of your currency, crowding out of private investments, because if government is borrowing so much and spending, the rates of interest for the private sector will become very high. If private investments don't happen, then a very efficient source of investment is going away from the economy, which is detrimental to the economy. Transparent, consistent, and not overly burdensome tax policies, and policies should promote competition, reduce foreign tariffs so that more integration happens, better technology comes into the country, more markets become available for your products. When investing in emerging markets like India, China, Brazil, Russia, you should be further careful about some macroeconomic aspects. First of all, check for the fiscal and monetary policies. So if the country is consistently running a deficit to GDP greater than 4%, then that indicates substantial risk. Risk comes because a big part of the spending is financed through borrowing. This borrowing will have to be repaid at some point in time. It may require printing of the currency. Hence, this currency may devalue. So if you invest in this currency, a lot of gains in the local currency may simply be washed out by the devaluation of the currency. The government can default. which can lead to further erosion in the value of your investments. Expected growth should be at least 4% in emerging market economies. Currency values and current account deficit should also be checked out for. Overvalued currency may encourage excessive borrowing. So if you see a current account deficit greater than 4% of the GDP, then again it is a cause of worry along similar lines. If total government debt is greater than 50% of the GDP or greater than 200% of the current account receipts, then again this indicates a high level of risk. Forex reserves should definitely be greater than the short-term debt repayments, so that at least the near-term principal repayments the country is easily able to service. And finally, government should be pro-reform, should be pro-liberalization, and government's stance on structural reform is very important. Macro is a very important macro factor that you should check before investing in emerging market economies. So how are different economies in the world linked? First of all, there are macroeconomic linkages that come from the purchasing power parity, inflation, prices of goods. So as things change in one economy, it will have an impact on nearby economies and other economies of the world as well. Linkages come from exchange rates. So exchange rates adjust so as to reflect the differences in the purchasing power parity and in interest rates and in inflation. If the exchange rate is pegged to another currency, or the interest rate is not changing because of macroeconomic factors, then there may be pressure on both sides. So weaker country will normally not be able to manage the peg or will not be able to maintain the peg because there will be too much intervention required by the central bank to maintain the peg. And hence, the weaker country will normally tend to abandon the peg when interest rates are high, depreciating its currency or devaluing its currency, making itself more competitive in the global scenario in order to boost its exports. So let's say India pegs its currency to at 50 INR to the USD. However, at this rate, everybody wants to sell the INR because we know that the currency is overvalued and the peg has been maintained by the central bank. To achieve or to maintain this peg, the central bank would have to consistently buy INR and sell USD because there is a lot of selling pressure on the INR. So if the government doesn't buy or the central bank doesn't buy, the INR will depreciate. So it will normally be difficult for the country to maintain this peg or to reduce its forex reserves to such a big extent. And secondly, depreciating the currency would normally help exports. It will be detrimental to the imports. However, it will boost exports and boost the competitiveness of industries in this country in the global scenario or in the global arena. The Fisher theorem said that the real interest rate in the world is the same. That is, the interest rate adjusted for inflation should be the same, otherwise there will be an arbitrage opportunity. You should borrow in one country, invest in the other to exploit the arbitrage. However, interest rate differentials exist because of different policies, different expectations on inflation, different levels of economic growth between various countries. So we're just trying to say that the returns for one country may depend on another country as well, or may depend on global factors as well. Economies of the world, different economies are interlinked with one another to the extent of the trade, the exchange rates between them, and the interest rate differentials that exist between the two markets. For forecasting economic data, on GDP, inflation, industrial production, etc., there are various techniques suggested. Econometric analysis employing regression type models or multi-factor models has the advantage that once established, the model can be reused. However, creating the model can be quite complex, and once that hard work is done, that model may most accurately reflect real-world circumstances, can provide precise quantitative forecasts of the various economic conditions. Disadvantage is that it can be complicated, difficult, and time-consuming to create. Proposed model may not be applicable in future periods, as normally we will be creating the model using historical data. Generally seen that econometric models are better at forecasting expansions than at predicting recessions. And it requires a lot of back testing, stress testing, and scrutiny of output to verify its validity and verify its usefulness. We can also use available economic indicators. So from government websites, various private agencies, data on two-wheeler production, cement production, industrial production, inflation, etc. is readily available. Using these economic indicators or a combination of these indicators to predict a recession or to predict a recovery, etc. can also be done. So if more economic indicators point towards expansionary economy, then we will conclude that the economy is in an expansion, a late expansion or an early recovery. If more economic indicators point towards a slowdown or a recession, then we will conclude in that direction. So advantage is that you don't have to do any calculations. All of these are available from outside parties, easy to understand and interpret, and can be adapted for specific purposes that we may have. Effectiveness generally has been verified by academic research, and hence many people in the world are using them. Problem is that they are not consistently accurate, as relationships can change from time to time, and forecasts often can be misleading or give us false confidence. A checklist approach is an even simpler method, wherein we have 5 data points, can also be 5 indicators that we want to check, and if we see that we can check all of these factors, we will conclude the economy is an expansion. If we can check another set of factors, we will conclude the economy is in a slowdown. The advantage of such an approach is that again it is simple and allows for changes in the model. So I can tweak that list or that set of factors that I want to check for depending on my understanding and depending on my estimation. Disadvantage is that it requires subjective judgment in order to decide when a recession is there or when the economic conditions have changed, may be time intensive to create, and may not be able to model complex relationships. So how do various asset classes behave under different economic conditions? Generally, we've seen that cash instruments or money market instruments are most affected by the short-term rates. Hence, fund managers of these instruments would be most focused upon central bank actions. The short-term rate is most impacted by central bank policy. The long-term rates may not be as impacted or may be differently impacted. So short-term money managers or money market managers generally focus on the short end of the curve, and depending on whether their view is that interest rates will fall or interest rates will rise, they adjust the duration of their portfolios. So if they feel interest rate will fall, they will reduce the duration. If they feel interest rates will rise, they will increase the duration by investing in longer maturity securities. These instruments, however, have a maturity of 1 year or less than 1 year for the most part. Credit risk-free bonds are government securities or risk-free securities that have a maturity greater than 1 year, generally in the tune of 10 to 20 years. The return given by these bonds is equal to the real yield or a real expected return plus a premium for inflation. So higher the expected inflation, higher will be the discount rate and lower will be the price of these bonds. So if you're expecting interest rates to go up or inflation to go up, even though central bank may be cutting interest rates, if inflationary pressures come in, interest rates may actually go up. Whereas on the shorter end of the curve, if the central bank cuts interest rates, normally the rates will go down. So that's how the job of a credit risk-free bond fund manager would be different from a very short-term money manager. So short-term investor will focus on cyclical changes only, that is predicting the rate of interest. Again, if he is expecting interest rates to go up, he will keep a lower duration. If he is expecting interest rates to go down, he will keep a higher duration. Higher economic growth is also generally detrimental for these bonds because people will move their money into equities and more riskier assets. If GDP growth is good, then these bonds will underperform or the yields will be higher. These bonds will perform good during recessionary times and when there is a flight to quality or people want to avoid risky assets and risky securities. That's when the yields will go down. Credit risky bonds would be affected by the real yield and inflation premium, but they would additionally be impacted by credit risk or default risk. So if favorable economic conditions are prevailing, then the risk premium embedded in these bonds would reduce and the yields would reduce, resulting in higher prices. If the economic environment generally is not that good, then the risk premium would expand, causing the prices of these bonds to fall. In the case of emerging government bonds, over and above the previous factors, you need to analyze country risk, you need to analyze currency risk, because these governments would need to acquire a hard currency for paying back their loans, as people would have normally lent to them in dollars or yen or euro or in some hard developed market currency. Nobody would have lent to India in INR because nobody wants INR back. Everybody wants their own currency back because that is what they'll have to use. So currency risk and country risk need to be especially analyzed for emerging market government bonds. Defaults are not very uncommon. So these governments and these countries as a whole have seen to have defaulted in the past. So even though we call these bonds risk-free in the local currency, they may not be risk-free from a global perspective. Inflation indexed bonds generally should not be impacted by inflation, but we've seen that when inflation is high, the price of these bonds goes up as the demand for these bonds goes up. So in times when the supply of these bonds is high and demand is low, prices would go down. And in inflationary times, when demand for these bonds is high and supply is low, prices would go up. The price of common stock can be derived by the Gordon growth model given as D1 upon KE minus G. So if expected economic growth is high, bond prices would go up. If interest rates and the cost of equity is high, the stock prices would go down and vice versa. If expected earnings in the economy is good, cash flows are expected to be good, then again stock prices would go up. So multiple risk factors play in the performance of stocks. These have a lot of idiosyncratic risk as well. So each stock and each market may need to be analyzed more thoroughly. Emerging market stocks generally provide higher returns with higher risk. So the volatility is also high and the expected return is also high. Increasingly, we are finding that emerging market stocks are becoming more and more correlated with the developed world, so that all stock markets in the world are going up and down together. So real estate is very sensitive to interest rates and inflation. So if interest rates go up, it has a double negative impact because the rate of discounting also goes up and the mortgage rate of financing of the interest rate also goes up, reducing the demand for real estate. When interest rates go down, mortgages are also easily available at a low rate and the discount rate also goes down, positively impacting the demand and the volume and the value of real estate. The payouts in real estate are generally in a bullet form as against bonds where there is a small coupon payment and then a big lump sum principal payment. The payouts on mortgages on real estate are relatively more equally distributed in terms of value. Hence, the changes in the yield curve will also affect prices a lot. That is, all rates matter for real estate investments or real estate mortgages. Unlike a bond wherein the rate, when the big lump sum payment is coming, is the rate in the yield curve that affects us the most. In mortgages, all rates are key because at all points a big lump sum payment is coming. Hence, changes in yield curve, that is if short-term rates change or long-term rates change, will also have more of an impact on real estate securities than on general bonds. So we've studied various theories about predicting exchange rates at level 1 and level 2. Level 3 gives us some more theories as to how exchange rates between economies move. The relative purchasing power parity states that it is the difference in inflation that drives exchange rates. Countries seeing higher inflation will see depreciating currencies. The relative economic strength theory says that countries with higher short-term rates will see more investment flowing into these countries and hence appreciating currencies. Countries with lower short-term rates will see investments moving out of these countries into other countries and a depreciating currency. The capital flows approach says it's not just about short-term rates. Even if short-term rates are high, but the long-term investment climate is not favorable, or the long-term expected returns are not good, money will not come into the country. So it says that countries with appreciating currencies are those where more capital flows are coming in. And more capital flows will come in countries that have a favorable investment climate, good long-term expected returns, liberalizing economies, growing economies, etc. So if a country can attract more equity investments, more FDI, then it will see an appreciating currency. If the long-term expectations are vice versa, then the currency will depreciate. So it basically argues that even a cut in rates can strengthen the currency if it improves the long-term outlook and vice versa. Relative economic strength, on the other hand, says shorter term rates or lower shorter term rates would mean depreciating currencies and higher shorter term rates may mean appreciating currency. Capital flows approach says vice versa is also easily possible. The fourth method, called the savings investment imbalance approach, says that a country has some investment requirement and it has some domestic savings to fund those investment requirements. If the investment requirement is greater than the domestic savings, that means the country will be dependent on foreign borrowing because domestic savings are not enough to fund all the investment. In such a case, capital must flow into the country and hence this country will ensure that the currency remains strong so as to attract capital regardless of other factors. On the other hand, if the investment requirements are low and domestic savings are high, then the country doesn't need foreign capital, or this country would not keep a strong currency because it has no incentive or it does not want to attract foreign capital, and hence the currency will depreciate. So Emily Schultz is a portfolio manager. She has predicted the following economic conditions for different countries. Depending on the forecasted data, you're required to advise her on reallocation of the assets. So first is the allocations within Colombia, wherein the 1 year spot rate is 9%, 2 year is 7%, and 3 year is 5%. That is, the yield curve is inverted. The current portfolio is 60% in stocks and 40% in bonds. So what would our advice be? So an inverted yield curve reflects that monetary policy is contractionary or short-term rates are high, and even fiscal policy is contractionary, which is why even in the long run there is not much hope from the economies, as the government spending is not much, tax rates are still high, so people do not anticipate much demand for money or much new investment or capex happening. So most likely prices are expected to fall, inflation is expected to fall in this country. In falling inflation, bonds tend to outperform equities. Hence, more of our allocation needs to be in bonds than in equities. Hence, Emily should move some of our portfolio from stocks to bonds. In Jan 2014, Ireland's Central Statistics Office announced that the country experienced deflation, with prices falling by 0.7% consistently in 2013. This is the first time deflation has hit the Irish economy since 1960. Overall consumer price index decreased by 2.7%. No investment is made in this country yet. In which assets, bonds, equity, and real estate should Emily invest? So looking at the question, there is no indication of a revival or no indication of things looking better in the near future. So we would advise Emily to invest more of a portfolio in bonds and fixed income instruments. If there was an indication of bottoming out, etc., then we would advise allocation to stocks. Emily is considering the purchase of government bonds in either emerging country, Hungary or Latvia. The countries have the following characteristics. Foreign exchange to short-term debt is 95% in Hungary. It's 180% in Latvia. Debt to GDP is 77% in Hungary and is 47% in Latvia. Where should she invest? So Emily should invest in Latvia, as on most critical requirements for emerging countries, that we saw that debt to GDP should be less than 50%. The foreign exchange should at least be equal to 100% of the short-term debt. Latvia passes the criteria while Hungary falls short. Emily has projected the trended growth rate for the economy of Turkey and Chile. She wants to make a long-term investment in either. She will use the savings investment imbalance approach to gauge the strengths of the currencies. Advise whether to invest in stocks or bonds. The countries have the following characteristics. So let's first compute the expected GDP growth for both countries. So the GDP growth for Turkey would be the tune of 2.4 plus 0.9 plus 3.5 plus 1.8, that is equal to 8.6%. Similarly, the GDP growth expected in Chile is equal to 3% plus 0.7% plus 2.7% plus 0.6%, that is 7%. So from an expected growth perspective, Turkey looks to be a better investment than Chile. And given an 8.6% expected growth, which normally will be accompanied with some inflation in the economy, because growth and good economic growth means inflation. During bad times, there is decline in prices and less inflation. Hence, equities would be a better investment than bonds. So we should invest in Turkey, and the portfolio should be more biased towards equities. The next part of the question asks that she will use the savings investment imbalance approach to gauge the strength of the currencies. We see that expected savings relative to investments are in a deficit in Turkey. Hence, Turkey is more dependent on foreign borrowing in order to meet its investment requirement. Hence, the currency is expected to remain strong. This is just the savings investment imbalance approach. In Chile, on the other hand, there is surplus saving relative to the investment requirement, and hence the currency is expected to be weak, since there is no requirement of foreign borrowing and hence no requirement to keep the currency strong.